Build versus buy is a heavily debated topic in the SaaS industry. When you need to build out a new feature, do you go and build it in-house where you have full control over the feature set with your developers, or do you partner with a vendor and a platform as a service in most cases who can provide a lot of those basic tools out of the box for you? Today we're talking to marketing leaders Mieke and Emilia from Cumul.io and UserPilot, as well as Nimrod, the CEO and founder of Cord. We approach the conversation from both ends of the spectrum because we acknowledge that it's very easy to let our biases dictate how we talk about the subject. So I hope you enjoy the conversation and get as much value out of it as I did. All right, hey everyone, thanks for joining us on this panel discussion today. Let's just do a round of intros. So I'm Brian, I'm the head of marketing of Paragon. We enable B2B SaaS companies to ship native integrations for their customers significantly faster and with less development and a low-code interface as well. I think there's a lot of use cases where, sometimes your team can be focusing on specific core product features versus integrations, and that's why we're here.
All right, I'll go next. So my name's Mieke. I'm the marketing manager at Cumul.io, which is a software platform for adding client-facing analytics to any SaaS platform or application. So we help SaaS companies to add a reporting or analytics layer to their application, and we help make that process extremely fast and easy to set up both for developers and for non-technical staff alike. So we offer a sort of off-the-shelf component that you can just plug and play into your existing tech stack and application.
That sounds very useful. So I'm Emilia. I'm head of marketing at UserPilot, which is the product growth platform that allows product marketers and product managers to build their user onboarding, in-app experiences, resource centers or in-app surveys such as NPS without coding with a visual WYSIWYG. So we also stand on the buy versus build equation, but yeah, there are a few use cases when we actually recommend to build as well.
And I'm Nimrod from Cord. I'm the CEO founder of Cord. And what we do is we make other SaaS platforms multiplayer. So we add real-time collaboration, and we essentially let you bring in your team and work just like you do in Figma or Notion or Google Docs. In any SaaS tool. And users like it because it makes them more in focus and work faster, and SaaS vendors like it because it helps with seat expansion, retention, and so on. And so we have these conversations again on build versus buy, on a daily basis with our clients.
Yeah, I know you're an engineer, Nimrod, but I'm curious, Mieke and Emilia, if your founders are all engineers as well.
So our founders, we have three founders, two of them more on the engineering side and one is more on the commercial side. So there's a mix of both, but there are two initial founders who are both an interesting story actually within this roundtable discussion. They both worked for consultancy companies, so they built those kinds of analytics tools a lot for different companies, for different customers. So at one point, they just said to each other, like, hey, this is a recurring problem. Let's build something that we can offer as a solution in the market to take away this pain or this problem much faster at a larger scale.
That's funny because we have a very similar founding story that our co-founders were one of them is like very technical background, back-end engineer. Another one is sort of more finance business, but also has a minor in engineering, so more on the front-end side. But they were building a chatbot solution and just realized that their users are not really figuring it out on their own. And then they tried to implement the onboarding, like hard code it, but because as a startup, a lot was changing in their actual product very frequently, they quickly realized they need a product that would manage the process of, logging these changes and actually implementing them. And they looked at their existing solutions and realized there is still work to do for this. So they actually switched from their original product to building a solution that would allow to manage onboarding.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. It's almost like they're the converted ones, right? Because on one side, it's like the hardest to get engineering on board with these types of tools, yet it's always the engineers that have these ideas for these tools as well. And so I think that's a very interesting kind of just perspective in terms of like what gets someone over the fence, and when do they realize the need outweighs kind of some of the concerns that may come with buying a tool. So I guess to kick off, the first question is, why do you think there's a general aversion to low code or no code tools in the market, especially when it comes to engineers, but also potentially product managers as well?
I can try and take a little bit of that, just coming from a background in engineering, and then at Facebook, which actually did a lot more build, even on things that are ridiculous. Like Facebook built its own sort of Tableau kind of BI analytics tool that you can drag and drop any metric and it'll plot a chart and build it from scratch internally. When it has nothing to do with Facebook's core business. So I've seen a lot of these decisions, and I was actually responsible for the very few things that Facebook did buy, which were essentially data. So we had big contracts with Comscore and Nielsen, and even then we didn't buy the Comscore and Nielsen SaaS, the UI. We just bought the raw data and ingested it into Facebook's own ecosystem. And I think a part of it, I feel, is becoming a sort of more challenging kind of movement, because engineers are more and more empowered, and they're bigger pieces of the sort of buying decision process than it was maybe 20 years ago, when you'd have like these orgs that are not tech sort of led, but are kind of tech enabled, with a lot of executive teams that were kind of older, didn't come from engineering, and there would be a top-down decision making where the CIO would say, we would go and have a steak dinner with some salesperson, and then you would go and drop this new thing. And today we all know about, and in fact, most of us probably also kind of use PLG and dev-led motions. And now the decision making starts from the devs. And so they look at something and they can assess themselves, both like, is it worth it? Can I just build this thing? How much work will it be to integrate it? What am I getting out of it? And then also, do I like it? Do I feel it's a high quality developer solution? These are very, very challenging, nuanced, different questions that we had to answer before. And I think our companies are successful because they're managing to answer them in the positive, or most engineers go, oh yeah, you know what, this is hard stuff. But it's definitely not the case always, and not the case for all companies.
Yeah, I think if I can add on to that, like especially from an engineering standpoint, oftentimes an engineer will think, what I can build better, or like you can customize it more when you build it yourself. And especially within early stage companies, what we see when we talk to more early stage companies, it's also sometimes a question of budget. So like being able to make those estimations of, okay, how much time will it take me to build this? Does it make sense to actually build it yourself? Does the cost of the resources and the staff that you need to build it yourself outweigh the cost of actually purchasing a solution that can help with that? We usually see that it's in a lot of cases, it's just much cheaper actually to buy instead of build. But if you, for example, just need a very basic component, and that's enough, then you might not need to buy expensive tools that will help you do the full suite. So it kind of depends on where you sit on that spectrum. But I guess a lot of resistance comes from having the feeling that the capacity exists to build it yourself, but it's just a matter of prioritizing. Is it far enough? Or is it close enough to your core business to actually provide it yourself? A bit like what you mentioned, Nimrod, about Facebook building their own analytics. It's really not core to their application. So in those instances, you would rather recommend to go with a partner that really focuses on that as their core business.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up the startup perspective, because I think we're looking at two ends of the stick here, like very extreme polarity. So on the one hand, we have a massive enterprise that doesn't care about the budget, but they are still deciding to build because they want this extremely high level of customization and personalization that a lot smaller SaaSes wouldn't provide to them, because, you know, then they would have to build for Facebook specifically, right? And it wouldn't be a SaaS anymore. On the other end of the spectrum, there are the really small startups that I used to work at, for instance, which, even though it's more expensive to build than to buy in the long run, in the short run, it depends on what resources are readily available at the moment. And if you are in a startup like I used to be in, Post4J, a social media scheduler, which was founded by 3 engineers, right? They had the development resources, more development resources than actual money resources, right? So in bootstrapped startups that have large engineering teams or founding members from the engineering background, they may often feel it's cheaper in the short term to build. What they don't take into consideration is that the engineers are not the end users, and they are not product managers as well. So ultimately, the whole team ends up with a lot of tech debt and very high alternative costs. I'll give you an example from my own playground, from User Pilot right now. We build our own website, right, using our engineering resources, which makes it very difficult to run experiments on in the marketing department now. And now we have to go back to square one and rebuild it using more scalable technologies that would allow people that don't code to make actual changes in order to experiment with the website and improve conversion rate. So we probably lost in conversion rate, right, by not running these experiments. And this is the kind of alternative costs that engineers don't take into account.
Yeah, especially when looking at, there's, on the one hand, there's just the initial building a feature, but then of course afterwards there's maintaining it as well. And I think that's also often forgotten when you go with the build approach, is that you still need resources once you've built it to actually maintain it, to make sure it's still up to date, to make sure it still answers security standards. You can think of a whole array of things that need to be maintained. And that's often forgotten when you first make that decision to build instead of buy.
Yeah, and I think with all ours, especially in our space, we're not just low code versus, building. It's also product facing, right? Or customer facing. And I think that adds a layer of complexity to the decision and weight, because when it's an internal tool, like us marketers, for sure, we know, we'll just throw in a script, right? We get a new tool, put it into Tag Manager, and now we have a new tool like Hotjar, for example. And if it doesn't work, we just take out the script and, no one knew, right? There is no impact on anyone's experience other than your own. Whereas I think when it comes to a build versus buy decision, where it's like, well, what if I run into an issue down the line? Now my customers are already using this feature. Now I have to rip it out. How do I handle that? What are the risks there? I think it just weighs a lot more heavily on, the decision maker in this case, because there's so many downstream effects of picking a solution that does not end up panning out the way that you want it to. So I think that's one of the challenges we may have faced, from a marketing perspective and in our businesses, but also a very valid point as to why I think there's more aversion potentially, at least in our experience, to using a low-code tool that is customer facing. And also, talking to certain ICs, they just love building, right? I mean, I think that's just another element of just, they became engineers to build, right? I think that's like having the power to say, I can build anything from nothing into something that people love. And I think taking that away also has, certain negative effects. But then I think as you get into, more managerial roles, you start seeing it from a slightly different perspective, right? It's like, well, now I have only 3 engineers. I have this much budget. How do I allocate my resources the most efficiently? And that's where, again, the maintenance cost and being able to communicate that from our perspective and, help them understand that as well is really important to, reduce the aversion towards using a tool like ours. Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
100%.
Also,
Go ahead, Emilia.
Yeah, thanks. So basically, if they make the decision to build essentially a separate product, right? The problem is that it ends up being kind of always half-baked, right? Because you ultimately need to make the decision to stop working on a product that is not related to your core business and go back to building your own product. So whoever is the end user of what the engineers have built, right, ends up with a half-baked product that's not nearly half as good as the industry standard in, the off-the-shelf solutions. And that includes, for instance, analytics. So again, very few companies actually understand how expensive it is to build. Like one of our clients used to work at Atlassian, and they decided to basically build an internal user pilot. And this project kind of bloated into building a fully fledged internal, the actual analytics, right, that would allow to track the return on investment of building specific in-app experiences is super important. They ended up spending $3 million in 2 years on this project. So, what kind of startup can afford to do that? Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, I would say I think you're very right on a couple of points here. First is I think I've seen that early stage startups that are pre-PMF, even pre-launch, they don't like to buy, not just because they lack the resources, but very often because, like you said, they like to build, they like to own this. This feels like progress, especially if they're technical. And they have this weird thing where they have a lot of time on their hands, actually, because they still don't know what they're doing. They haven't cracked the GTM. They're building the feature set. And this is, again, as you said, sort of, we're all in businesses that provide a user-facing aspect of the software. And so they feel they want to be in full control over it. And on the other hand, while they have a lot of time, they're also moving very fast. And then the ones that are most likely, in my experience at least, to select buying versus building are the ones that are more established, and now they actually have to hit hard metrics every quarter, and every bit of time spent on building something that has to already ship in high quality in order to serve their clients, their existing clients, where you sell to the PM and the business execs first, and then they know that they will need to corral an engineering and product team around it, and work with them to ship it and go through multiple iterations and all the problems. They're just more realistic about that sort of cost than I think the early stage startups are, at least first sort of ones that come from like first time founders. And so we've had this scenario where like it's much easier to sell to bigger orgs rather than smaller ones, which is surprising. The other thing is, I think we sit in front of PMs and engineers and designers because, again, this is software that will affect the surface of the product. And the PMs, we give something, right? Because we give them the power, in Cumulio to give analytics, to give a feature to their users, to onboard users more efficiently in User Pilot, to, give the users this feature of integrating with their other products and so on. And to the engineers, we give something because we give them a powerful API that's high quality, that's crafted, that's easy to implement, et cetera, et cetera. With the designers, we take away the power. And so I've seen a couple of instances in which the people who were raising the most rejections on like security issues or like all kinds of, concerns that are typically, outside of their world were the designers who felt, this cool project of like building an exciting, dashboard for their clients, or building the, onboarding flow, or building the integrations, or building the communication, collaboration capabilities in our case, was taken away from them. And sometimes they already designed it at the point they came to us. Sometimes it was just a cool new project they were put on. Sometimes they were halfway into building it. And now, someone else gets to do that. So we discovered over time that part of what we need to give them is that power back to, design this, to design the experience, to control the experience, even when we believe that we, sometimes already have the answers just from our base of clients and doing this and researching the space for years, right? So that was an interesting insight on Build versus Buy for me.
Yeah, I think a trend that we're also seeing and that we also value ourselves very highly at Kumul.io is indeed to give that power and to have a sort of white label component and just a lot of customization options to make sure that it's not just a basic or default module that they put in there and that's the way it is and that's how it shows, but to still give them enough power to customize it and to add it seamlessly to how the rest of the application looks like. So I think that's also an important aspect of those off-the-shelf components. It's easy to plug in, but you don't want to take away the creativity and the possibilities that can differ a lot from use case to use case.
We have the same experience that, ironically, even though less than 15% of all our users use custom CSS on the experiences, it very often comes in the demo. So they want to have something then that they are not actually using later on, just to feel safe that they have full, basically, freehand over customization options.
Yeah.
So we allow them to still, customize a lot, basically using color swatches and everything can be done no code, but just having the security that if something needs to be completely custom coded on the front end, they still can do it. That helps. But yeah, the numbers speak for themselves. At the end of the day, they're not even using this.
Yeah.
But it is this feeling of insecurity when it comes to like very customer facing components. Like in our case, onboarding or the resource center, it has to match the native UI perfectly. So it doesn't, stand out like a sore thumb. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when you think about products like Intercom, right, where they've been able to build a brand for themselves. I mean, this is something we'll talk about later in this discussion, but that becomes less of a concern or deciding factor in some ways, in my opinion. It's almost like, oh, we're using Intercom and that's a sign of credibility, right? People will even intentionally not white label it because it's just to show like we are using the Intercom. We didn't build our own chatbot. This is very reliable. So yeah, it's really interesting how I think maybe in the earlier stages, it is important to provide that customizability, but it becomes potentially less prevalent as, you get into later stages of growth. In general, I think I see this as, the IC to manager transition for a lot of individuals, like a parallel in that sense, where you're very used to having full control of everything you're doing, right? And you deliver it and you feel very proud of it. And suddenly now you're told, hey, now you're a manager, right? You have to give someone else the tasks that you were previously in 100% control of. And you may not necessarily really know the person who's taking on the tasks, right? And you still feel very close. It was your baby that you were, owning. And so now when there's a lack of trust and you're forced to give away the responsibility, I think there's a lot of uneasiness and, potentially baggage, rightfully so, from previous experiences where, Nimrod, you're saying there are times when it's very top down, right? Hey, we found this tool, implement it, and then they're forced to make it work even though that it wasn't necessarily designed to work for the use case specifically. So
it's also could be a way to gain control, in the company. I'm not saying a lot of people are thinking about it like this Machiavellian way that if I build, an internal tool and I'm the only person that really knows how it works, right? Then but yeah, it could also be the scenario in like small startups that, ultimately this person is indisposable because they are the only person that knows how something works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So I guess to shift away from the aversion side, what do you think should be the most, in rank order almost, priority in terms of like what they should be evaluating when they're making a decision, right? Because obviously we do think in a lot of cases buying does make sense, but what do you think helps with that decision? What are the non-negotiables, right? So are there certain instances where it's, you should definitely build, right? And so, yeah, what in your opinion is that prioritized list of decision-making factors and, check boxes per se?
I can start. I a lot of what I thought of before when I was an engineer or a PM was you don't buy your core capability. And I know we talk a lot with our clients about giving them the space and the time to focus on their core capability. But it's definitely something that goes wrong when you buy your differentiator essentially. And we've seen this in some of the companies I worked at, and I've seen this from other buyers. So we like to make sure that we are complementary. The other thing though, and I think Mieke made this point earlier, which is you also don't buy something that is like so far away from your core that it's inconsequential. Because if it's inconsequential, the quality doesn't matter, the longevity of it doesn't matter. You just need a quick hack. If it's simple enough, you're likely. So it's something that's in this periphery where it's additive enough for you to even invest in the decision of build versus buy, for you to like have a bar for the quality of the product that you're getting or giving your users in our cases, but that is not unique to you. That is just a part of the suite of things that you need to do. So I think that's like where I think there's this Goldilocks zone, right, where the feature sits. The other thing that I think tips the scale to buy, and it's a very good strategy that a lot of the good sort of software supply chain, to steal a phrase from Jeff Lawson, we were all in the software supply chain, right? We're providing parts for these like manufacturers that create their original SaaS tool, and we're just a component like a door handle in a car or whatever. And another thing that can tip the scale for them is if you provide something that they cannot build themselves. And by cannot, I mean they literally, it comes from the unique place that you have in the market and the fact that you sell to a lot of them and so on. And an example of this is, Jeff Lawson's own company, Twilio. What they do is they give you, access to send notifications over SMS, email, etc. And their SMS product, which was the sort of what began the success of the company, had to do with negotiating big contracts on huge bulks of SMS units from all kinds of carriers. And that's something that no single company could do because they wouldn't know their scale, they wouldn't have the same negotiation terms and so on. And Twilio essentially did this and bought them at scale and then resold them. And so if you can bring about, this is usually a very big strategy question, but if you can bring about something into the discussion where there's no way for that particular client to build, and that's usually a very good way.
Yeah, I think what Nimrod mentioned about the peripheral area, right, where this is just the door handle. I would say that definitely this is the use case when a company can consider building it themselves. I would add that if this is something that doesn't scale because the door handle will pretty much stay the same throughout the, use of the car, right? Or, this is something that is not going to be amended or used by multiple people, right? Then you can definitely consider building it, right? So for instance, in the case of onboarding, if your tool is, say, a micro SaaS, right? It has one use case, one persona, and it pretty much stays more or less the same. And it won't be a big problem to even if you change something to like redo the hard-coded onboarding. But if you have several use cases, several different user personas, and you actually need a team to manage your onboarding in the background, it will be very, very difficult to do it when it's been hard-coded by engineers.
Oh, that makes total sense. I think, we covered like the basic things, like how how core is it to your application? Is it far enough, or is it too close? Do we have the time internally to build it, and not just to build, but also to maintain it? Do we have the resources and the knowledge internally? I think there's one other aspect that's also at some stages very important that we may not have addressed yet, and that's how fast do we want it? What is the timeline? Because building it yourself can take up much more time, and sometimes you want to invest that time, and your timeline can be a bit longer, because you really want that core aspect to be just as you want it, just because it's such an important part of the platform that you're building. In other moments, and we talked about it a bit earlier as well, is like at some stages in your growth, there can be a lot of pressure to grow faster, and the timeline might be a bit more strict, and you may want to see ROI much faster of the investment that you're making, and that's where a buy decision could take the overhand over a build decision, just because you can move faster, you can go to market much faster. While, for example, in the earlier stages, you may want to take a bit more time to really build it out before you actually take it to market. While if you're already commercializing your platform and customers are eagerly asking for one of those customer-facing modules, you may have less time to actually spend on building it out just the way you want it, and a buy solution may be a better choice.
Yeah, I'm not sure if any of you have encountered this issue. Potentially, I see Emilia more so as well. Just with integrations, I think it's somewhat of it feels a bit like a one and done type of operation, where I just need to ship it once, and then I never have to deal with it again. So I think that that's generally not the case, because use cases can always change, and you ideally want to create a deeper integration over time. But one thing we've seen is that oftentimes earlier stage also don't have a clear sense of maybe they have a clear sense of the short-term use case, right? And it's like, great, your product meets our short-term needs. But when it gets into, well, now it's embedded in our product, we're stuck with you for, potentially the longevity of our product, right? If as a decision maker, I don't have a clear sense of what that eventual use case is going to be, it makes it really hard for me to also evaluate your product against whether or not your product can meet those needs, right? So I think oftentimes it's really important for decision makers to try to map that out as much as possible, to say, okay, I'm investing in, dashboards, I'm investing in, collaborative functionality or onboarding. What does that look like? What does that potentially need to look like? Because if it can't meet certain use cases that we're pretty confident we're going to build, then it's a no-brainer that it's not a buy decision at this point, right? Because you're not going to build that feature, or there's very low confidence that you will be able to build that feature for us or prioritize it, especially if it's a little more specific. So I think that's where extensibility becomes pretty important for a lot of products. Is great, you have all these tools that we can use, but are you also able to accommodate some of the more nuanced use cases that are very specific to me? Like, do you have that backdoor, I guess they would probably call it, to let them build it within the platform without one of our customers call it like Frankensteining something together, which is you build half of the feature on this low code tool, and then you build the other half completely from scratch, because you just can't get that functionality. So I think those are all very real factors for people to consider when they're evaluating a product.
Yeah, it's definitely an important one to keep in mind before you actually make the decision.
It's very hard to make that decision sometimes, especially at an early stage, because you don't know where your company is going in like 5 years' time, right? By which time you may be stuck with a certain solution, right, which has become very irreplaceable. And that also made me think about the cost of scaling certain off-the-shelf solutions, like the classic example with Intercom, for instance, right? That it got a lot of early stage companies on its startup plan, right? But then the pricing goes up very, very steeply as the number of your MAUs goes up. So if you have like a minimal use case, I would say for onboarding with Intercom, I wouldn't say it's the right tool to use, because you will end up having a really, really bad value for money, right? If you have, for instance, a B2C solution that is fairly simple, right? It doesn't require that much onboarding, but you will have a lot of MAUs, right?
Yeah.
I agree a lot. Go ahead, Mieke.
Go ahead, Nimrod.
Thanks. I think, yeah, a lot of what we hear, I think the most sophisticated buyers, and there's very few and far between, they are actually, they don't tend to be engineers from my experience, but the most sophisticated buyers are looking at things like, yeah, how much will it cost me if I'm massively successful? Because if it runs into the, say I'm costing $20 million a year now because I have a usage-based scaling and I got into like a very successful company, will they rip me out because it costs so much? Is a question for both sides. Both sides want to know that they're not going to get, ripped out because it's going to be so massive. Secondly, these questions of quality of service come up a lot. They want to know about your longevity. We get asked a lot because we're an early stage startup about, this is something that my users will use. I will never be, they know that they go in, they sign the contract with you, they will never be able to rip it out. And it feels like such an important marriage that they want to make sure that you're going to be providing a high quality of service, that you're going to be continually sort of innovative, that you're going to, be there. And we sometimes have clients that ask for sort of continuity clauses where in the contract, essentially, if we get bought out or we suddenly stop having the service, we're able to somehow guarantee that they will continue being able to use it. And lastly, I think again, sort of unique to our place, they are coming to the build versus buy decision oftentimes before they build something themselves. And that means that they sometimes haven't even done discovery.
Yeah.
And like you come to them and they have this idea, but they don't really know what their clients' use cases are. Mm-hmm. They don't, and that's another thing where I think the best of the software supply chain companies, and I know it for sure for UserPilot, and I, haven't explored deeply with your companies, Brian and Mieke, but I'm pretty sure that the successful ones, what they do is they think not of just the software component they give, but also of the marketing they give to help your users use Paragon, use Cumulio within, their app. They help them launch the feature, make a big win out of having this new capability inside their software. So we're like almost marketing for our clients as well, right? Not just to them, but like for them with their clients. Help do the user research, help do the, bring the use cases and case studies to bear to understand, how to choose between all of these customization options, just like the whole cycle of, marketing, discovery, and implementation, and then support, quality, maintenance. That has to be sold as a package, and the best buyers understand that they need to assess a good, build versus buy criteria across all of these, and what are they getting across all of these.
Mm-hmm.
Almost like a checklist, right? And another thing that a lot of buyers may not be able, if they are not sophisticated enough to anticipate, is also the integrations, right? So say a couple of years down the road, you decide to change your CRM and you have opted into a solution that is very sticky. So you have extremely high switching costs and you can't, move to a new CRM, right? Also because of the other tool you have used, right? So say UserPilot is pretty sticky. If you build all these in-app onboarding experiences, it's not like you can change another tool because, for instance, like we don't have integration with Pipedrive, we have integration with HubSpot, right? And now you decide HubSpot is becoming too expensive for you, your contract is expiring, you want to move to Pipedrive. That means you can't get the data, right, until you build like a custom integration or, you know, API integration on Zapier or not. You need to think about like how it's going to fit into your tool stack, also in the perspective of a couple more years, right? So it's an extremely difficult decision to make.
Yeah, and I think generally they'll want to find what feels like a strategic partner as well, right? I think that's it's not just you're selling us a tool and then we're left on our own to figure it out. It's, you know, during onboarding or during, you know, discovery with, you know, let's say a proof of concept, do I feel supported? Am I talking to engineers or am I talking to people who don't seem like they really understand what we're trying to build? I think that's for us been very successful, and one of the reasons that people have picked us as a vendor is they're like, wow, like the support we received from your engineering team has been so great, because they're engineers themselves, right? The ones implementing it initially. And so I think having that confidence that we're not just picking some low-code tool and dealing with people who aren't necessarily technical enough to support us on our journey, I think that's important, to be like almost like a strategic partner that's like in the weeds with them when they need it.
Yeah, they're not just buying a tool, they're also buying partly expertise from a field that they aren't too familiar with. Yeah, completely agree.
Great point.
That is a very strong point. I think, you know, the job to be done of a lot of these tools is not just, you know, solving the specific problem, but also telling you how to solve it. You know, the great content that I consume from User Pilot is teaching me how to onboard users. It incidentally is possible to do via User Pilot. It might be relevant even if I chose another provider, but the fact that there's a lot of this great training there is what I'm buying, not just the technological capability to do it. I want to buy the expertise of the tool builders who are so, again, sort of immersed in that specific world.
Absolutely. The biggest problem a lot of our users have is not that they don't know how to use User Pilot, that they don't know how to build the experiences, but they don't know what to build to make them actually effective. That's why we provide like the onboarding sessions with our product specialists to help them come up with the strategy as well. And this is part of the price, right? That wouldn't be included in the price of, you know, say the number of hours an engineer would spend building the solution, right? And that's why it may seem like it's a bit more expensive, even if you have calculated it that way. But in fact, you're buying the consulting services. And some of our users are even like, oh, could we pay you $1,000 more so you build it for us?
Yeah, we've definitely seen that issue too, where, you know, they get excited even. I mean, they make a purchasing decision, which is, you know, great for us, but then they realize, oh, I haven't actually realized, like, what is the integration going to look like? Or for example, maybe with Camille, what are the dashboards that are going to be the most impactful for us, right? Or what is my aha moment, right? That I need to try and drive users to, or even, you know, at what point does collaboration make sense? And in other cases, it's less of a priority. I think, again, they're builders, right? But how can we help them along that journey? And I've used User Pilot in the past, and that onboarding session I had was really helpful, because otherwise you run into this blank slate problem where you're like, great, I have all these tools, I just don't know what to do with them. And that can actually make them regret the decision potentially sometimes, because it's like, oh, now there's so much more that I'm responsible for than I thought, or that I originally signed up for, right? Because I'm buying this tool, I assume it to be just solving all my problems, and I realize there's still a lot of strategic ownership in that decision.
Yeah, and I think also over time, those needs can change. So you might start with, oh, our customers need this and this and this. If I look at just dashboards, you get the questions of your customers. We want to have those insights and those insights. So you start with like one template dashboard, but when they start using it, you start learning like, oh, this would be valuable for them, or this would be good for them, and offer extra added value from our platform. And the ability to also have a partner that's agile, or a tool that's agile enough to make changes and to deploy new dashboards, for example, in our case, is also quite important, because you can have an idea from the start, but it can change over time, and the needs of your customers will change over time as well. So it's always important to keep that in mind as well when you make the decision, like, is it something that we can easily adapt, whether it's building or buying, because sometimes it might even be easier to adapt when you build it yourself, while in other cases it might be very hard to make adaptations when you build it, and might be easier when you buy an off-the-shelf solution.
Mm-hmm. Great.
I think we're in this unique position that exacerbates the build versus buy question, because we're all selling to SaaS companies. Mm-hmm. They are builders. They are techs first. And if you're in a lot of other places in the sort of supply chain, production chain, so on, like I'm thinking of, recently spoke a lot to the Frame.io guys who built a collaborative video editor that got acquired by Adobe. But when they were selling this, to people who couldn't build this internally themselves. There's no build versus buy. In a lot of places, there's no build versus buy, because the buyer just doesn't have that level of capabilities, and we're selling to very, very, very capable, very sophisticated companies.
On the flip side, you mentioned benchmarking, right? That sometimes the value lies in the sheer number of users that are using the same solution, and that provides certain benchmarking. So for instance, it would be pretty easy to build something like Profitwell, or even, build out a dashboard in, say, Databox, right? That would fetch the same data from different data sources, HubSpot, Google Analytics, da. But you wouldn't be able to benchmark them without having the gross volume of other users in similar industries, right? Providing data to Profitwell and then get anonymized, and you can compare yourselves to other, SaaS companies in your space. Like, yeah, that's another reason.
Absolutely. And Paragon, I think, is a great example of this, because you put in, this sort of integration capability with Paragon, and automatically you have the network of everything that Paragon connects to, which you can't anticipate what your users will want to connect to. And even if you did, you'll have to build out and maintain this thing that is just an n squared kind of problem, and it's just gets harder. So it comes built in with an advantage to buy this versus build it yourself. So yeah, I think when buying, that should be made very, very clear to the buyer that this is what they're, this is the advantage that they're getting. And if they don't see it, because like you said, Brian, they don't look around the corner at what they'll need in 5 years' time, that's a part of the win.
Mm-hmm.
I think we should probably transcribe this conversation into a checklist, like buy, build.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's so many good points that we've shared here, and a lot of new perspectives for me too as well to listen to. So this has been great. I know we're short on time, so I might have to skip one of the last two questions, but thanks for taking the time. This is really insightful, and I'm really excited to have future conversations with all of you on this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Brian, for organizing this.
Likewise, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Brian.
Thanks for inviting us. I learned a lot.